Hey everybody. That works. I'm Scott Alley. I'm an editor at Dark Horse Comics. Just want to introduce everybody really quickly. We're going to talk about horror comics kind of informally for a little while. And if you have questions, please ask them because we don't really have a script or anything. So I'm Scott Alley. I'm an editor at Dark Horse. I edit Hellboy, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, The Goon, and I don't think any other horror stuff right now.
I'm Shauna Gore. I was an editor at Dark Horse Comics until this past week, and now I'm a freelance editor. And I've edited, Creepy and Eerie. I did all the classic Creepy and Eerie archives for Dark Horse, and I did the first year of the new Creepy comics. I was Scott's editor on The Devil's Footprint, his own creator-owned horror series. And I worked for a long time with Steve Niles on Criminal Macabre and Freaks of the Heartland and a bunch of his really awesome stuff, among others.
This video is brought to you by TFAW.com. Visit TFAW.com and use the code Stumptown at checkout to save $5 on your next purchase of $20 or more. TFAW.com.
Hello, this is my first panel, sorry. My name is Patrick Reynolds and I am an artist at Dark Horse, and I just pretty much do what Scott tells me to do. And I recently finished Let Me In Crossroads, and I also did Serenity Float Out with Patton Oswalt, and Age Safety and the Haunted Boy, and that's it for right now.
The Let Me In series that he just finished, it was a prequel to the American version of Let the Right One In.
Yes.
I'm Todd Herman. I'm a freelance artist. I did The Fog and Cut at Dark Horse, and I did the Fall of Cthulhu Nemesis at Boom, and I'm working on a book called Cry Wolf, which is a werewolf book for Dynamite.
I think I can talk loudly enough that we don't need that for me. My name is Brandon Seifert. I write a book called Witch Doctor. Got picked up by Robert Kirkman's new imprint at Image, and the first miniseries is coming out starting in June of this year.
I'm Eric Powell. I do a comic called The Goon. I was told there would be donuts here, and I'm highly disappointed. There's not even a crawler or a bear claw.
I ate him. I'm so fat.
Okay, again, this is sort of loosey-goosey. So I guess we're going to talk just a little bit about the history of horror comics. There's a little bit of a sort of standard tutorial, I think, when it comes to thinking about horror comics in America. Do you guys know about the Comics Code Authority that sort of came down, crashing down on comics in the 50s? Yeah. So it's gone. It is officially gone. But there was sort of a really interesting thing that happened where, once a long time ago, there were many genres of comics in America. There were romance comics and more horror comics and mystery and crime and all that kind of stuff. When the Comics Code Authority came down, it basically outlawed, in the world of publishing comics, the use of certain words and certain imagery. So you couldn't have words like terror in your title, and you couldn't have words like horror in a title. You couldn't show certain kinds of violence. So basically, what had once been a really thriving industry in terms of horror comics in America was really neutered severely.
And the edgiest horror stuff that was being done at the time was being done in comics. The movies of the time were very tame. They had to be. The comics were incredibly edgy and set in place, I think, a lot of stuff that later would become cliche because it was so good when they did it the first time, people just kept repeating it.
Yeah.
And so sometimes when you read those kitschy old horror comics from the 50s, they seem overly familiar, but it's because they made such an indelible impression that people just regurgitated it for a long time.
Yeah, and that's so one of the wonderful things that actually happened in the wake of the Comics Code Authority unleashing its own horror on the world was that there was a really innovative publisher named Jim Warren, who was the guy behind Creepy and Eerie magazine, and later Vampirella, and he was basically just a really sort of ingenious kind of guy with with just a lot of business know-how and a lot of ideas of things to try. And what he decided to do was to do horror comics in a magazine format. So thereby skipping the comics format, the Comics Code Authority rules no longer apply. So one of the reasons Creepy and Eerie, when they started hitting the stands in the early 60s, they blew people's minds because not only was it this like beautiful, full-size 8x10 presentation of comics art, it was also scary and violent and chock full of horror and all the wonderful things that people had been missing in comics for a long time. So that's a lot of times there's, people who talk comics a lot will talk about the War and Revolution and what that meant. And that's basically, it was a really smart way to sort of subvert this ridiculous code. And it sort of pumped all sorts of new gross blood into the world of horror comics.
And then that stuff started to affect the mainstream a lot. Artists like Bernie Wrightson, I don't know, where was Bernie's first work?
His first stuff was actually, some of it was, his first work was published in a fan letter to Creepy, which is super cute. And then he basically started getting small gigs here and there in more publications in like the late 60s. And then by the early 70s, he was much sought after by publishers like DC and Marvel.
The art was so good in the Creepy books that Marvel and DC went after a lot of those artists, and Marvel and DC started pushing the boundaries again to see what they could get away with under the Comics Code, because they wanted part of that market that Creepy and Eerie were dominating. And then the underground comics that were popping up in the 70s, which initially were sold in head shops in San Francisco, a lot of that stuff was very sexual, a lot of it was real humor-based, but there was a bunch of it that was real crazy horror, much more visceral than the stuff even in Creepy and Eerie. Two of my favorite books of all time are Skull and Slow Death from Last Gasp Comics, and they were published they were sold through head shops, and then later when the direct market sprang up, these books were able to get out to the same people that were buying Spider-Man and Batman. Does everybody know what the direct market is? It's a very insulated way of selling comics that has allowed companies like Dark Horse to thrive, and allowed these companies to pop up that couldn't have popped up if we had to enter the game by fighting for newsstand share against Marvel and DC. And it allows artists like Eric he initially did The Goon one way, and then he self-published for a while. The Goon ran his 4 self-published issues for a while. He was able to do that direct through comic stores all over the country because of this particular system. So artists have been able to get their own work out there without the involvement of a publisher because of this direct market system. But it's also so insulated that it's increasingly difficult to do that these days.
I think it'd be neat to talk to, because one of the things I always like talking to Eric about are the old comics he used to read. And on the topic of Creepy and Eerie, Eric was the first artist I got to hire to work on the new Creepy when we resurrected it at Dark Horse a couple of years ago. So in the light of that, I think it would be sort of interesting to talk about maybe what horror comics we all read that got us into it when we were kids. Like, because there was weird, I started reading Creepy when I was 6 years old, and that's weird. But it's...
You're just like every other girl.
I'm just like every other girl. But I think there was a point when there were probably all of us finding things we weren't supposed to find, like if it was heavy metal or like whatever it was you found on liquor store shelves in the 70s when your parents were buying beer. I don't know, Eric. I want to get Pal talking.
Yeah, my uncle had a bunch of Bernie Wrightson Swamp Thing comics in his basement, and it just gets bad. No, I'm just kidding. No, I remember being down there and playing and like stumbling across this because I didn't even know he read comics, and I think that's virtually all that was down there were the Bernie Wrightson Swamp Thing comics, and they kind of blew my mind because where I lived is very rural, and the only thing I ever saw on a newsstand was, the Marvel and DC superhero stuff. It just looked a lot more detailed and a lot more interesting than that stuff. So that's kind of, even before I knew who he was, I knew who he was.
Yeah, Bernie brought this amazing illustrator quality to comics that didn't exist at the time. Nobody was doing what Bernie brought into it. And then a lot of people, tried to imitate it a little bit. But yeah, Bernie at that time brought in something that didn't exist. Corbin's another one from that time period that's blown me away.
You mentioned Slow Death. Didn't he do that? The Slow Death comic?
I don't think he was in Slow Death. That was Corbin was.
Corbin.
Yeah. Corbin was in Slow Death and Skull. He was an innovator on the computer. He was the only guy using computers to do art for comics at that time. He did a lot of grayscale kind of stuff. Yeah, in the early 70s.
Was he using? I thought he was using airbrush.
He did, but he was also using computers for some
in the
reason.
70s.
I think so. Yeah, I mean, unless I misunderstood. I've gotten to work with Corbin a bunch now on Hellboy comics for Dark Horse, and he's a living legend who's, you know, as good as he's ever been.
Yeah, I think one of the neat things that era of comics, or that era of horror comics did was it, you know, a lot of the artists who became huge in the wake of like the Warren books and the horror resurgence of the 60s were guys who did beautiful stuff like Gene Colan and Bernie Wrightson and Angela Torres and Joe Orlando and all these guys who could really, really draw. And so I think there's this weird tradition of horror comics in America being really beautifully drawn, which is funny when you talk to somebody about horror comics. It's like, wow, this is so beautiful. But and I think that came from the freedom that they felt sort of after breaking off the shackles of the comics code, you know.
But also, I think a big influence on Wrightson and a big reason why Wrightson hit the way he did was Graham Ingalls was an artist on the old EC horror comics. And all the EC books, like there's a lot of different styles that went into the EC books, but Graham Ingalls was the one that really like shook me up. He has that very lush style, a lot of detail, but more distortion. What's that?
It looks drippy.
Yeah, everything looks like it came out of a swamp, and it's actually scary looking. A lot of the guys that drew the horror comics for EC were the same guys that drew the war comics or the humor comics. Their styles didn't necessarily. Johnny Craig's style doesn't really lend itself to horror necessarily. The ghastly Graham Ingalls couldn't have done anything else.
Yeah, the one guy I think that could do all that stuff real easily and switch back and forth from like humor stuff to anything else was Jack Davis.
Yeah, because his stuff was so exaggerated.
Yeah.
And there's also a lot to be said. One of the things we'll probably get to is like techniques in horror storytelling. It's really hard to make comics scary because you're looking at this thing on paper and you know, you can only build up so much tension in 2 pages, and you have to work at page turns and that kind of stuff. But artists who are that good, a lot of these guys like Johnny Craig and Gene Colan, and these guys are considered classic horror artists because they did so much work in that genre. But it's not the style; it's their amazing storytelling that really does it. Because that's one thing you really need to tell a good horror story in comics is really solid storytelling. Otherwise, your scares will be lost. You know, so that's why I think guys like that are often considered horror artists because they were so, you know, their acumen when it comes to storytelling really helped the stories be scary.
Craig made everything feel real normal, but then you could take the emotional stuff to this really high level.
Yeah, exactly.
Like everything felt very realistic and then very, very terrible.
Yeah.
Oh, and something, if there's any aspiring writers or artists out there, you should realize that even though the Comics Code Authority is gone, you still can't put the word sodomy on the cover of a comic.
Well, you could.
Yeah, there's still certain levels of censorship.
Do any of you guys want to pipe in on the history stuff, Patrick, or anybody?
I think my first exposure to horror comics, I don't even know if it's a horror comic because I've never gone back and read it again, but I was about 8 years old, and I was in a bookstore in Fairbanks, Alaska, and I was in the comics section, and I found, I think it's Vic and Blood, Harlan Ellison and Richard Corbin, and I flip it open, and it's like mountains of skulls and this really voluptuous naked woman, and I was like 8, and I absolutely couldn't parse it. Like, it traumatized me for years. And a couple years ago, I'm in Powell's, and I'm like looking through the shelves, and I've completely forgotten about it, and I find it on the shelf, and I just have like horrible flashbacks and have to leave the room. And that's honestly, that was like the extent of my horror comics experience when I was young. I came to horror kind of as a teenager and came to horror comics as a genre very recently.
Corbin has to be one of the most unappreciated guys in comics.
Yeah, he's
that guy's
fucking amazing.
Yes, he is.
My experience is even more limited than yours, Brandon. The scariest thing I saw when I was a kid was were my brother's Iron Maiden band posters. And it terrified the shit out of me. He had this Metallica shirt of, it glowed in the dark. There was this guy being electrocuted off an electric chair. And I had to sit behind him when we were going on family road trips. I just remember that being the scary. I was scared of skeletons until I was like 26. But then when I was a teenager, I to my detriment, I do not read a lot of comics, and it probably shows when you look at my artwork. But I think that when I picked up Arkham Asylum, by Dave McKean and Grant Morrison. It's not really a horror comic, but it is scary as hell.
Pretty dark.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty dark.
And it's as a story, it's kind of a mess, but it's also kind of a dream. So it's supposed to be. But I remember looking at that, and I remember saying that makes me want to draw comics. There was so much suggestion in the shadow and in the anticipation of what was coming, and I thought that's what. That's to me was the scariest. Were the scariest things that I ever saw, and including films, was the things that you didn't see but were suggested that you would see. Like when your imagination is allowed to scare the hell out of you, is when I think horror becomes very powerful.
And that's a tough thing to pull off in comics. Like comics is kind of all about showing it. So walking that line between not showing it and suggesting it, but giving the reader something to look at, it can be tough. I mean, one of the hardest things is trying to figure out if you're doing a story where you are setting out to scare somebody, it's really difficult. I mean, like Eric, The Goon is a really funny book, and Billy has a lot of humor in it too. But you get into the horror subject matter a lot. Do you ever set out to scare somebody with something you're doing in those stories?
I don't think I ever go into any of it with much of a battle plan, like here I need to scare somebody. I just
See the Chinatown video.
Yeah. I don't. It's just whatever I think works in that situation. It's not like here. All right, I did 2 jokes, now I need a scare. I never do anything like that.
Right. Brandon, Witch Doctor hasn't come out yet. He's done ash cams at conventions for the past few years, and the first issue comes out from Image soon. But you want to give him, in a nutshell, what Witch Doctor is?
Sure, yeah. Witch Doctor is a horror medical drama. It's sort of, we always describe it as Doctor Strange meets Dr. House. It's sort of this, it's this jerk doctor character who has kind of come from a medical background and is now kind of studying magic and studying the supernatural, but from a medical standpoint. And he's trying to find more or less a vaccine for the apocalypse. And so it's got the horror component and it's got the medical drama component. And then, it's basically we're just throwing everything that we enjoy at it. So there's a lot of comedy, there's a lot of kind of action adventure stuff. And it's, hopefully it doesn't come out too schizophrenic, but
He's
it
got
does
the,
have
he's got the
potential.
perfect artist for it. Lucas, is Lucas here?
He's
He's at the
unfortunately, he's
table?
manning the table.
Good. You should be making money for you. Lucas Kettner is this great artist. He interned at Dark Horse a long time ago. He's this terrific artist whose style is very reminiscent and owes something to Bernie Wrightson. And last night he insisted that it owes something to you too, Eric, remember? That was the guy you met last night. But his style brings so much of the mood and atmosphere and the horror to Witch Doctor. Witch Doctor is such a weird book. It plays with a Lovecraftian kind of horror in that the concepts are just so weird and disturbing. There's not really scenes that are set up to scare you so much, but the conceptual stuff is just so bizarre that it gets that horror vibe across, I think.
Yeah, that's the hope. One of the things that we do is that all the monsters in it are sourced in actual biology and medicine. So if you got a vampire is a blood-feeding animal. And there's certain adaptations that animals have that make it easier to feed on blood. There's chemicals they have in their saliva. There's a certain way of biting people. Fangs are a ridiculous way to draw blood from somebody. Like if you look at blood-feeding mammals, vampire bats have really sharp, basically it's their front teeth. They're extremely sharp. They don't have fangs. So it's trying to take these things, there's like all these horrible, horrible things in the real world, like parasitic cancer. There are tumors that are destroying the Tasmanian devil population because they're spreading from animal to animal. And it all just started as one tumor. And then a Tasmanian devil bit another one, and there's been like an 80% crash in the population. And taking that kind of stuff and then combining it with like zombies and werewolves and all that, it's really fun, and hopefully it ends up being really disturbing. It's hard for me to gauge at this point because it's warped my personality so much doing the research for this book. Like when I was doing the early research, Lucas apparently, I found this out recently, he does not open photo references that I send him while he's eating. Because frequently it'll be like, here's this baby with an arm coming out of its face. Isn't that amazing? Because I have no frame of reference for this anymore. So yeah, I don't really know where I'm going with that.
So Todd, with Cry Wolf, that's the name of the new one, right?
Yeah.
This is based on a series of paranormal romance novels by,
Yeah.
what's her name?
Patricia Briggs.
Right. So is there much, it's all about werewolves and monsters and stuff, but mood-wise and like, in terms of.
It's
the
kind of a
emotion?
romance, actually. It's more romance-based. It's like horror romance.
Right.
In the same sense. I think there's similarities to Twilight in a way, except it's maybe for an older audience.
Right.
I mean, and for me, like, one of the reasons I enjoy doing the book so much is, for me, discovering horror comics came through Alex Toth, who's also, to me, my favorite romance artist of the 50s and probably 60s. And so I enjoy seeing those elements together in a book. That's the kind of book I'd like to do. So.
But you get to draw monsters.
Yeah, and I
I
think
do.
that also brings up an interesting point that we've talked about before at other horror panels, about the notion of how much other entertainment in general these days, things that you don't think of as horror, are sort of horror flavored. Like you get romance for teenage girls now, and it's all horror flavored, and they're vampires and werewolves, and it's just sort of interesting how the genres are all sort of blending now. And so people are discovering a love for things like vampires and werewolves. But a lot of these people right now, they're 10 or 11-year-old girls who are reading the Twilight books, and it's really interesting where that might lead them. You know, maybe they'll stick with romance, or maybe they'll peel off the horror stuff and go with that.
Yeah, I wondered if kids reading Harry Potter would wind up discovering Dennis Wheatley down the road, and probably that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
I was hoping for a minute.
It might here and there, you know, those discoveries are small when they happen. But I think it's interesting what it's allowing for other genres, like what it allows for a romance book to be written with like supernatural stuff involved in it. Like, what does it allow for the story? It allows all sorts of interesting things for the story and the characters to develop. So that's one of those things I'm sort of curious to see how far that's going to go, because I know that there's an awful lot of horror-themed romance out there.
It's all the rage.
Yeah. So where we are now, does anybody have any questions? Anything to start with, or? Why the hell are you guys at this panel?
I want to know what comic that is.
There are chairs here. They can sit.
Oh yeah, share that with them.
I brought a show and tell. Yes, Night Force.
You do it.
We did Scott and I think Hal,
Yeah.
maybe Eric, you were on this panel too. We did a horror panel at San Diego last year, and somebody asked Mike Mignola, who was also on the panel, we were talking about scary images, and you know, what does it take to really make a comic scary, because it's hard to do it. And sometimes, you know, when it comes down to the simplest thing is sheer imagery, and there aren't that many images that are just disturbing, you know. I mean, you can think of a lot of violent images and stuff, but for something that's not violent, that's just spooky. So Mignola named this old Gene Colan Marvel comic Night Force. And I'd never read it. I'm a big fan of Gene's. And so for Christmas this year, my husband got me the entire run of Night Force off of eBay. And it just happened to have this panel that Mignola thinks is like one of the scariest things he's ever seen. And it's this really awesome phantom dude with a giant snake coming out of his flaming face. So it's one of those, like, there's the beauty of comics. Like, it would have been hard in 1973 to make a movie showing this.
Yeah.
But you get somebody like Gene Colan who can just draw the hell out of anything, and it's pretty dark and disturbing. It's a pretty crazy comic. So that was just a total coincidence, but I thought it was fun, because one of the things we have to talk about in panels like this is what makes a comic scary, and how do you approach it as an artist or a writer to make it so that your comics are actually scary.
But it's funny because you can't see any detail from where you're at, but you can see that this is like the most colorful thing you could ever ask
Totally.
for. So like the deep inky blacks of the Hellboy comic are not really what Gene was going for here.
The panel description says bathes in scarlet. I'm like, that looked like it got spray painted in neon.
Yeah.
So it's not, a lot has been done with printing and color comics.
Probably
Yeah.
much more sophisticated.
Yeah, so that's, this is one of the interesting topics. How many people in here are creators? Are all your readers? Do you guys create horror comics? Is that some of this stuff? Cool. So what do you want to know? Yes?
When's the best time to use exaggeration, subtlety, or, for lack of a better term, exaggerated subtlety?
Oh.
Well, if you're going for a big shock, you definitely want to be very subtle before that, because the more subdued, I guess, you could make the reader with what's going on,
The more
and then
comfort.
smack them in the face. that you want to do? Like this.
Yeah, I think like one of the things that I like a lot in comics is when there's a dramatic sense of contrast in a lot of different ways, whether it's in the drawing with like the heavy blacks I was talking about, or yeah, if the mood goes up and down like that. So I think that's part of it too. I think another thing, I know that sometimes I used to try to be real subtle about everything, and then I realized nothing would hit, nothing would stick with the reader if it's all soft. But one thing I figured out with horror comics a little bit is that it is really hard to pull off some of these mood things. It is really hard to shock anybody with an image. So sometimes, not that you can do this all the time, but I think sometimes it works in comics to kind of like go under it. If you're going for a really creepy image that might wind up being ridiculous when drawn, make it more subtle and subdued so you get back to that thing of, I'm not really sure what I'm looking at. We just had this problem in a Baltimore comic, this comic that Mike Mignola and Chris Golden do. In the upcoming series, there's this transformation bit where this owl turns into this like demonic dude sort of thing. And and the transformation bit that Chris Golden had scripted happened really fast, and the artist drew it like 3 different ways, and it just looked silly. And like, I think what we got to do is just have it kind of happen off panel. Like, it's just going to look stupid. An owl turning into a guy. There's probably a way to do it. Somebody could have drawn it. Mignola's like, I don't know what to do. And if he didn't know what to do, I kind of felt like we were at our wits' end. And was like, you know what? Let's have it kind of happen off panel. Like, get big black shapes in the foreground that make it so you're not sure what you're looking at, and then you get into it. So rather than hit the reader over the head with that transformation, rather than hit the reader over the head with this owl man thing, we kind of skated past it by going more subdued, hiding it, because it wasn't the most effective thing to do in a comic. You know, in a film, there are now ways to do that really, really, really well. And we kind of felt like, no, we need this to happen story-wise, but we can kind of skate past it visually.
Yep.
So then how do you make that decision between where to actually show and when to not? Is it mostly just when you're not exactly sure like where to go?
Story of my life, my God. That's all, you know, I found out as I inked or just drew Let Me In, that was 90% of my problem was deciding what to do and what not to do. And some of the shots, like in issue 4, there was this huge double-page spread that came out. We can talk about it, right?
Yeah.
Okay. This huge double-page spread where the villain, the guy in the tie, goes into this basement full of bodies. And there's one light source, and it's the stove, and it's just full of bodies. And I thought, well, I'm very close to making this not look scary, make it look like maybe a weird kind of Roman orgy scene if I don't be careful with the lighting. So I used the lighting to, like German expressionists and those old films did, like, you know, Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Just the lighting is sort of, even though there was a lot of detail, like I sort of had to hide enough things to have people say, ew, is that guy's ribs or is that a banana? I don't know. Wow. So there's that suggestion that I was talking about again, where the things that I remember seeing that were terrifying me were in movies mostly, like Poltergeist and even Silent Hill, the video game, not the movie. Where I just didn't know what I was looking at. I knew there was something gooey coming out of that guy's mouth, but I didn't know what it was. But I mean, was it an angle or was it the lighting? And I tried to remember what kinds of things made it that effective to me. You know, the filmmaker shot that at an angle so that it looks bigger or something. And I'm a big hack. I sort of would copy that. So I look at people who have done it better, and that's kind of where I draw from it. And as you keep doing it, you know, you learn to form ideas on your own, but you're just going to have to do a lot of crappy pages, I've noticed. So.
Yeah, I think the answer to both of those questions is you figure it out. Mm-hmm. And it's, unfortunately, there's no shortcut, there's no easy solution. It's just, you have to, and you figure it out differently in each situation. Hopefully it gets easier over time. I haven't gotten to that point yet. I'm still very new at this. And this is something that we've been on, Lucas and I, the second issue of our comic is this sort of folklore fairy changeling thing. And I want to do this sort of, you know, basically the idea is that a fairy is inhuman creature that is mimicking humans. The way there's certain kinds of spiders that mimic ants, and you can't tell by looking at it that it's a spider because because of the way it's designed, and that it's holding two of its legs together to look like antenna. And as a person just looking at it, like, I have no idea that this thing is a spider instead of an ant. But if you're an ant, maybe you've got some idea. And so this is the kind of thing that we're trying to channel, and I want to do this sort of uncanny valley thing, but it's very difficult in comics to do something like that, because if you're doing something with a human with exaggerated like eyes that are larger than normal, maybe that's just how the artist draws the eyes. So it's we kind of went around and had to go through a bunch of different designs for this thing, and we had to figure out how to present it in the issue so that there'd be some contrast between it and actual humans, so you can tell how screwed up it is. But it is, it's.
I think knowing what effect you want to have on the reader has a lot to do with it, and that variation thing, doing it different ways at different times. But really knowing what you want the reader's response to be is going to determine how much you hold back. With really trying to do something that's scary, really trying to do something in the genre to get the emotional effect of a horror story. I think there needs to be a lot of mystery. I think that's one of the problems with a lot of what people have called horror comics, is there should be a mysterious area in the story. There should be stuff that can get you off your game and make you not know everything that's happening. It shouldn't read like a science fiction story where the interesting stuff is all explained out to you. And in a lot of horror movies and a lot of horror comics, it is all just spelled out. Like you see the monster clearly. You get a lengthy explanation of where he came from, what created him, and it saps the mystery right out of it. And with the Hellboy books, while the emotional reaction we're looking for isn't necessarily fear, we're basically telling action-adventure stories with a lot of supernatural and horror elements in it, but we're trying to maintain that horror atmosphere and that horror element by keeping a lot of it mysterious and keeping a lot of it left for the reader to ponder. I think that's an essential part of keeping that horror experience alive for the reader. Or you can just play with the tropes, the vampires and the werewolves, and give them a different kind of experience. Give them a straight up action story. Yep.
You guys think black and white versus color makes much of a difference? Because I always think of those horrible Stephen Gamble illustrations from Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark.
Yeah.
And for me, black and white is usually scarier than color.
I think it's color is an effective tool. When I was editing Creepy and we were doing it black and white, it was funny how many potential scripts I got from people that were, the color red plays a big part in the scene. It's like, oh, but it can't because it's black and white. So that's something that I think it provides interesting challenges for the artist to figure out, how to, and the writers too, like how do we tell the story using black and white as a medium? But it's a personal preference for mine. I think that's, I love black and white. Like Kelly Jones is one of my favorite artists, and his black and white stuff blows my mind. And I think he works better than when he's colored. I like his stuff kept black and white. Pardon me, but color is more like a tool. I think that some people need it, and some people use it really well. But I think if you're a capable artist, you can tell stories just as well in black and white, and especially have them be very evocative and very, sort of feel like a horror story.
And in comics, coloring is often terrible. So like it kills the horror mood, like for sure. It can. A lot of comic book coloring is awful, so it's going to kill any mood that the artist may have achieved in the black and white. But if you have a really good colorist, then it's just going to accentuate the mood. Like the Goon, Let Me In. We've all done stuff with Dave Stewart, who's a local colorist here, and Dave knows how to really deliver that horror mood in a powerful way that never, I think, takes away from the black and white stuff. And then there's other artists that can't do it to save their colorists who can't do it to save their lives. But yeah, like Shauna says, it's a tool that can be applied well or applied badly. It can enhance or it can ruin it. But like Piju was a horror graphic novel that we did this year that was black and white that I wouldn't have wanted it any other
Yeah.
way. It definitely, maybe more than any other genre in comics, black and white horror comics certainly have a place.
Yeah, and that actually brings up something that I meant to mention earlier, when Scott was talking about how horror is really effective a lot of times when you don't explain too much. I've actually come to like a lot of horror manga and Japanese comics.
And that makes no sense.
Yeah.
Anybody read,
Yeah.
what's the Spirals book?
Oh, yeah,
Uzumaki.
Uzumaki. Yeah, that's
Ah.
one of my very favorite comics.
Did you ever read that? It's amazing.
It's amazing. One of my
so
favorite
weird.
comics, black and white, and the whole. So Uzumaki was this great. It was actually made into a wonderful film too. Totally insane film. And the whole story of Uzumaki is there's a town in Japan that's haunted by the notion of the spiral.
And,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
that's it.
And that's it.
And it's,
so
but
there's
it's
spirals
so
everywhere.
bizarre.
And so people like meet these horrible deaths, and you just find their bodies all twisted up into the shape of a spiral.
Yeah, one guy gets run over, and somehow he got sucked up in the wheel well of the car, and he's wrapped. His whole body is wrapped around the wheel well of the car, and I believe they take the tire off
Yeah.
to get him out. And so when they take the tire off, you see him.
Yeah. A lady falls into a washing machine and dies, and it
But
sounds.
a lot of it's much more subtle than that. Like that, there's that graphic, insane stuff, and then there's like
Kid gets stuck in a blender.
Yeah.
That's the whole movie.
But it's actually really, it's really great, and it says this crazy thing with tension when you're reading it, because you have no idea what the hell is going on, but all these people are dying, and there's this like heightened sense of panic, like who else is gonna die?
But to me, like I love Uzumaki is I believe 3 volumes,
Yeah,
right? And I
uh-huh.
loved volume 1, but then volume 2 is like, all right, now we're gonna explain everything,
totally,
and they
exactly.
spend 2 volumes making it make sense. I'm like, throw those away. I'm just gonna keep volume 1 because that made no sense, and it was
Totally.
all mood and atmosphere and just panic.
Totally.
Great.
Yeah, and so if that's something that, I highly recommend exploring Asian horror stuff, if you guys like that notion, because you get some crazy ass ideas rooted in absolutely nothing, and it just yields really great like emotional stuff.
Yep.
So in terms of just like absurd type thing, absurd horror, is it, what is the most absurd thing you've actually seen in horror?
Oh, there's so much. It's like,
Like in terms of fears, like playing off a person's fear, like what absurd fears have you guys experienced?
Lady Gaga's album cover.
yeah.
Definitely Lady Gaga, not actually comics. But
Yeah.
um,
Boy.
I want to say that big sheep beast that Kelly drew in.
Yes.
Kelly Jones has a thing about women.
Yeah, Kelly is hilarious. How many people in here know Kelly Jones' artwork? Amazing, amazing stuff. He's very well known for doing some great looking Batman stuff, back in the 90s especially. But yeah, Kelly drew a succubus for a Cal McDonald, for a Criminal Macabre miniseries. And it was basically a giant vagina with legs.
Terrifying.
And picked up men, and it was so funny. It was hilarious. And that's what
I don't think Kelly got it though. I think Kelly was.
Oh no, Kelly totally got it. Oh, Kelly totally got it. It was great. But it's that
So
kind
over the
of,
top.
a lot of the times horror stuff is that kind of, you know, like you're looking at it and it's more fun. Even, you know, like I pointed out the wonderful Gene Colan down here. It's a guy with a big snake coming out of his mouth, and it's just so disturbing. It's just one of those, like, it's just such a wrong image. And I think that sort of notion of things just being wrong is important when you're trying to tell horror stories. Like one of my favorite weird moments in horror, sort of off topic, is from a Shakespeare play in Macbeth, when the shit hits the fan in Macbeth and things start going really bad. One of Macbeth's officers rides back to the castle and says that off in the distance horses are eating each other. And it's this crazy notion that like things are so bad, like things are so rotten in the kingdom that horses have started eating each other.
And much better told than shown.
Yeah,
Like it's
totally.
try drawing that and make it as effective.
Yeah, there's like, they just have horses like chewing on each other. But that's a perfect example. That's actually a great point. That's a perfect example of the kind of thing that is so haunting if you hear it, and especially if it's delivered sort of as an aside. But if you make it this big, like, wow, look at these horses chewing on each other, it's not.
It could get dull.
And
Yeah.
speaking of saying something and not showing it, it's also, and one of the reasons I think Mignola is so great, economy in the writing, I think, is essential for horror too, because you're writing a bunch of flowery, especially in comics, you're writing a bunch of flowery dialogue and everything. You kill the suspense.
Yes.
Mhm.
You know, one of my, I think maybe my favorite horror moment from a comic was in Wolves of St. August, Hellboy, Wolves of St. August, when Kate Corrigan, this woman that Hellboy's on the mission with, is in the ruins of this church where we know there are werewolves, and she encounters this little girl, and the girl, terrified and depressed, and the girl's like, come on, honey, we gotta get, Kate says, come on, we gotta get out of here, and the girl's like, no, no, I have to stay here, and she says, God hates me, and Kate says, oh no, honey, he doesn't, and the girl says, yes, he does, and then you turn the page, and the girl's a wolf, and she says, he made me this. And it just like, it lands so perfectly in that comic. It's such a bizarre moment. You're unsettled because you think one thing's happening. You think you've come upon a victim. But that Mignola economy of language, he just hit this thing so well. He made you feel it so well with very few words. And then that essential page turn. Like if you had seen that little girl turn into a werewolf, if you'd seen her a page in advance, none of that dialogue would have packed any punch at all. But because you didn't see it coming, and then you see it, it works like $1 million.
One of the things I really like in that story is that they're werewolves that actually look like wolves.
Yeah.
Yeah, but they stand upright.
They do.
It's such
which
he
is-
did such a cool design job on the werewolf in that.
Yeah, and usually when you see wolves and werewolves in fiction, they look nothing like actual wolves. They don't look remotely like them.
You know,
and that was like the first time that I saw, and they use that imagery again in an issue of BPRD, which is this wolf that stands upright on its back legs, and its legs are jointed all wrong.
Right.
And it's a very subtle change that's rooted in something real, and I've always found that really disturbing.
So Todd, with Cry Wolf, you're taking this popular series of novels, turning it into comics.
Right.
What kind of process did you guys go through in figuring out how the wolves were going to be presented, the werewolves were going to be presented? Because your werewolves look pretty much like wolves, right?
They do. I guess I haven't drawn it yet, but I guess there are sequences where they're between a wolf and a person.
Mm-hmm.
So and also there's like good wolves and bad wolves. They're mostly good wolves.
Yeah.
So they're supposed to be powerful and bigger than a regular wolf, but they're not necessarily supposed to be scary and gnarly. They're supposed to
They're
be sort
romantic
of,
wolves.
yeah, romantic.
It's all very romantic.
Because the whole focus of the stories is like pack order and like the alpha male wolf getting with the omega female wolf, stuff like that. So that's
amazing.
Yeah, when I started drawing it, I realized I had no idea how to draw a wolf. I had to teach myself. Wolves are really hard to draw. Fur is really hard to draw, actually. There's a big difference between drawing a wolf and drawing a horse. Like horses don't have hair all over them, so you can draw anatomy and stuff.
Right.
Whereas wolves are all furry and fur is moving all over the place, and there's all these joints that I had never thought about before. But it's fun.
Any other questions? Yep.
Do you have a favorite or least favorite creature or horror-themed animal to draw?
Well, the funny thing is, me and Todd for years have been talking about doing a werewolf comic. Like we circled around the idea of a werewolf comic for so long. When I heard he got this job, I was excited for him, but I was also like, all right, so is this a warm-up to us doing ours, or is ours just never going to happen now?
Well, hard to say. I think if you're talking about werewolves, I think there's tons of different ways to approach a werewolf. I think they're actually really underused, and most of the time when they've been done in films at least, and I've tried to gather as many books about werewolves just because I'm a fan, and I feel like the subject's not really very well explored.
I think part of it is that it doesn't have a Dracula. It doesn't have like a masterpiece that you can't get around. So there's like anything goes with werewolves. That's why I'm intrigued by werewolves, is I don't feel like the great werewolf story's been done. So
No, I think that werewolves are scary on different levels. I mean, there's like Dracula. There's kind of there's a metaphorical quality to a monster, and I don't necessarily think that has been explored with werewolves the way that it has with like Frankenstein and vampires and Dracula and
even zombies.
Absolutely. I'm a giant fan of American Werewolf in London. That's a really, really scary movie. But I also just think that there's something about animals that scare us on a base level of they're different than humans. They just survive, and that's different than living in a house. And I don't know. I do feel like there's got to be other ways to explore. If I did my own werewolf book, I wouldn't do it in a mainstream sort of way. I don't know if that makes any sense. But.
Yep.
Why is changing so scary? But when we dream, we change all the time.
Oh, I don't think changing is scary. I just think I think you know, having to like hunt for survival, and I think that there's a certain subconscious area where I think humans don't like to think about the fact that we're animals too, and that is a werewolf could be a reminder of that.
Well, and that kind of change is also all about losing control, and losing control is scary. Everybody's afraid of losing control one way or another. So I think that's what's scary about that particular change. And usually when change is used in horror stories, transformation or something, the lack of control is scary. And I think when you have dreams where you transform, it can be beautiful and it can be amazing and fun, or it can feel like you're out of control, and usually those dreams are pretty scary.
Isn't that it's kind of an interesting duality where it's like a horrible thing, but it's beautiful at the same time?
Yeah, it can
And I
be,
think
sure.
horror comics obviously bridge that gap. Because
Well,
there's a lot
I
of
think-
negativity, but there's a lot of beauty in it.
I think if I was transforming into something other than a human, you know, transforming into an animal or a monster, my first reaction would be, my first reaction would be like, am I going to come back to being a people later? Because I would just assume I wouldn't, and that was probably the first thing I would freak out about. No offense to animals. I think animals are great.
In terms of I like the question about what kinds of creatures are interesting. I think Scott might agree with me on this. I really love demon stories, and I sort of miss, like, there was that great heyday in the 70s of all these awesome demon horror movies, and that really sort of colored the way I think about horror and some of the things I think are scary. And one of the reasons I think demons can really work well in stories is because it goes back to that you don't need to explain them all that much. And I think they're better because you can approach a story with a demon like, okay, it's a minion of Satan and it came to get your soul and it's part of the Christian hierarchy. It's that kind of story. Or it's just some screwy thing from another dimension and, you know, who knows how it got there or what it wants. And that's the kind of stuff that is really fascinating to me. And also totally open-ended as to how they can be depicted.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the power of the Lovecraft myth, the Cthulhu stuff from Lovecraft, is that nobody else has done such a significant amount of work. And they're not demons in any kind of Christian sense, and they're not demons in a real formal sense, but they are these unknowable creatures that are totally unlike us, that we can't quite understand, and nobody's done a body of work like that except Lovecraft, and I think that's part of the huge significance of him. We just got the sign that we're out of time, so thanks everybody, and thanks to all these guys for joining us.
Brought to you by Tfal.com, the world's best online retailer of comics and collectibles. Whatever you're into, we've got just the thing for your collection.